Around the British Isles and also around the world are a number of walled towns. Some of these date back to even the Roman times, however many saw their defensive structures constructed during the medieval period. The Saxons and Danes would strengthen the Roman defences, seeing the worth in them, and would create boroughs. In the Domesday Book there would be 112 recorded boroughs or walled towns, but why were these created? Was it purely for defence or was it something else? Join us today as we look at medieval town walls, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the time period between the 11th and 16th century, England and Wales had around 230 towns that had defensive elements to them, either walls, earthworks or town gates. These fortifications had a rather wide history. As mentioned, some date back to the Roman times, and others have their foundations in the Burh settlement, the new walled towns that were made during the 9th and 10th century in Saxon England. Following the Norman conquest, towns did develop their defences for a few reasons. Firstly was the fear of invasion or uprising. This made town walls seem a necessity and would have given the town's inhabitants a sense of security that they could feel protected should an uprising be about to occur. If a revolt was about to take place and an enemy was heading towards the town, then the gates could simply be closed and the enemy would have to try and scale the walls, in which the guards could then protect the inhabitants. Town walls also helped control the amount of people who came in and out of a settlement, and could help to prevent outsiders getting inside the town. Gatehouses could be manned by soldiers who would check people in and out of the towns. One issue though is that town walls were expensive to maintain, and the medieval period isn't characterised as a period of great wealth and opulence, and if a town grew, then the town walls were needed to be maintained to allow the settlement to continue to thrive. The cost was heavy, but the crown sometimes granted these areas royal permission to collect a tax called muirage, which was paid for work on the town walls and defences. The walls would also be used to allow travelling merchants in and out of a settlement, and many would travel into a town to sell their wares and make some money. During the time of the Black Death, in which a great pestilence hit England, towns began to seal off their gates and settlements to outside traders to help protect the people from not a physical attack, but from the horrific bout of the illness. Recently I travelled to a town in the very north of England called Berwick-upon-Tweed, and it's a town known famously for its town walls. However, these have a much more different story, and in particular were developed during the Tudor era for a huge defence of the realm. Berwick is a town that throughout the medieval period held a strategic importance along the Anglo-Scottish border during wars between England and the Scots. Still today, in fact, it's one of the last major towns north before you reach the Scottish border, and because of its location, it was the site of many raids, sieges and takeovers. William I of Scotland attempted to capture northern England in 1173, and after its defeat, Berwick would become English, and was then later sold back to William by Richard I. By the mid-13th century, it had become a prosperous town, and was a site of a huge commercial importance. In fact, an English bishop even described it as another Alexandria, whose riches were the sea and the water within its walls. Edward I would later go on to recapture Berwick in a huge devastating massacre that saw the death of around 20,000 of its inhabitants. Going into the early 14th century, Berwick was again retaken by the Scots in April 1318, and the English would retake it again 15 years later. Berwick would be a turbulent place to live. However, during this time, one of its biggest defences was in fact the walls that had been developed over a period of time. The town walls were first built in the early 14th century by Edward I following his capture of the town. When they were finished, they were about 2 miles long and were over 3 feet thick and around 22 feet high. A number of towers were also added around the wall, and they were funded by the muirage grant mentioned earlier. By 1405, the walls though had fallen into a state of decay and disrepair, and their weakness led to the town's easy capture. There was a castle built into the medieval wall that still today partly does stand. This was founded in the 12th century by Scottish King David I, and with the castle being also in a disputed border country, it needed to be a huge stronghold. It sits on the edge of the river, on a huge mound of earth, and it would have been a rather intimidating structure. The only part of the castle that survives today is part of the late 13th century White Wall, which would have been its huge curtain wall. Having strong points and castles or towers to support the medieval wall would have been hugely important, as it allowed garrison soldiers to be based there, and also acted as a huge intimidation factor to potential attackers. Berwick's walls are still extremely prominent today, but most of them date back to the Tudor period. In 1558, Calais had been lost to the French, and Mary I looked to make Berwick secure from attack from Scotland. Scotland was allied with the French, due to Mary Queen of Scots being betrothed to the French Dauphin. Sir Richard Lee was entrusted with rebuilding Berwick's walls to strongly fortify the town against the Scots, and he planned a huge new addition. He used a new bastion system rather than to improve the older medieval walls and their perimeter, and a number of bastions were built into the walls to have guns mounted to defend against the enemy artillery. Warfare was changing at this time, and the town walls of Berwick needed to as well. Building would continue during the reign of Elizabeth I and would be a huge financial burden on the Queen. It was the most costly building project of the Queen's reign, and construction finished in 1570, with the defences actually being unfinished. The new walls were smaller than the medieval ones, and allowed for more artillery emplacements and 5 new bastions inside. One of these was a windmill bastion, which used 2 tiers of mounted guns to defend the town. The bastion was also angled specifically to cover a certain part of the horizon. Many of the guns in this area were also concealed, which would have led to the enemy being confused. Also, the 16th century walls included 4 gates to allow entrance and exit in and out of the town. But going back to the medieval times, gates and gatehouses were always really the weakness to a town's defensive structure and makeup. They were the target of entry and exit into a settlement, and these areas would also be weaker than where there was just wall. So medieval town walls did serve a number of purposes, but mostly construction would take place with defence in the forefront. By the later medieval period, town walls did take, however, a less militaristic role, and were closely associated with civic pride and local governance. The English Civil War of the 17th century would press many of the town walls back into service, but today a few still stand and remain. Within many towns and cities in Britain, parts of the medieval town walls do still exist. They may not be huge or miles long in their appearance now, but they do serve as a reminder of the medieval period and as a time in which conflict was in the front of everyone's mind. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.